It's time for us to begin. First, I want to welcome you in spite of what's going on outside in the weather. I came from the east side of Los Angeles, and it took 2.5 hours, 30 miles. We in Southern California wish for rain, right? But when we get it, we don't know. We don't know how to drive in it. We don't know how to maneuver around it. But here we are. Thank you very much for coming. But I especially want to welcome to UCLA my friends and colleagues sitting here. Professor Mario T García from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Rosalío Muñoz, whom you'll get to meet in a bit. And now, Professor Garcia and I have known each other for a number of years. He is a prolific writer. He's published work on Bert Corona, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Luis Leal, Father Virgil Cordano, and he has a new biography on Father Luis Olivares that's available for you to purchase at the back. And it's on Father Olivares and the Sanctuary Movement in Los Angeles that just come out. It's a freshly minted book, and it's available for you to buy. In addition, he's going to be making a presentation on that very same book tomorrow. He's daring to get wet again tomorrow, but he'll be here. He'll be in Bunch Hall. I often utilize his work because he uses oral history. He takes the oral history approach as a historian, and he allows activists to provide their testimonios. And it's a recording of their experiences, their struggles, and it's often activists who have not written their own material, who have not written their own stories. So it's important that he record them and he make them available to others that are interested in learning about the experiences and the struggles of these activists that become very important historical figures. Several of the publications deal with what he calls generational trilogy. He has written on the immigrant generation of the early 20th century, when a large number of Mexican immigrants came into the United States. Then he conceptualized the period of the Mexican-American generation, in many cases the children of the immigrant generation, and their particular story in adjusting and struggling in this country as US-born Mexicans. Then, in 2011, he published Blowout, Sal Castro and the Chicano Struggle for Educational Justice, which moved him directly into the Chicano generation. And Professor Garcia's trilogy provides a very broad and sweeping panorama of Chicano history. And I use, quite often, I return to the book Blowouts. I use it in the class that I offer in the summer. It's this class that I offer focuses in on the blowouts and its antecedents, which would be the Mendes case of 1947. But I use this book quite a bit, and it's because, for me, and for many others, Sal Castro was an iconic and very motivational figure in our history. I met Sal Castro in 1968. He came to UCLA to ask UMAS, United Mexican American Students, for support in the forthcoming walkouts that would occur in March of 1968. Many years later, after I had received my doctorate, we met informally. I think it was a book reading somewhere, and we noticed each other and we started to talk. And he said, "Carlos, you should come to the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference and present." make a presentation on the Mendez case. The Chicano Youth Leadership Conference, which was established in 1963, and for all these years was the primary instrument for creating that core of high school students that acted to change the schools. And I did. I presented on the Mendez case and the segregation of Mexican youth into Mexican schools. Mexican youth were segregated into these schools just as black students were segregated in the South, just as Asian students were segregated into all Asian schools or all Asian classes. Oh, I presented on that, but there were many other academics and scholars who presented at the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference. Mario García is one of them. He continues to be a presenter at CYLC. And we do that as volunteers. We do that as volunteers to continue to educate the youth, the high school students, and to prepare them. And also to offer up models, examples of individuals that do indeed earn their doctorates and that do indeed make history, their own history, write their own history. This is something that Sal Castro always urges students to do, educate themselves. No sean mensos, go to college and graduate. But he did this because he would ask his students, do you know your history? Do you know where you came from? And most of them didn't know. A large majority didn't know. So he would say to them, if you don't know your history, then your history doesn't exist. Worse yet, if you don't know your history and you don't educate yourself and you don't write your history, someone else is going to write it and they're going to get it wrong. So he was telling Mexican youth, prepare yourself, educate yourself, write your own history in whatever area of, whatever you select to do. So the Chicano Generation, Testimonios of the Movement, brings us the life stories of three individuals: Gloria Arellanes, Raúl Ruiz, and Rosalío Muñoz. Each story underscores the complexities of the Chicano movement. But I'm drawn to Rosalío's testimony. There were many aha moments for me. Ah, yes, that's the way it was. Or yes, I remember that. And this is because Rosalío and I were students here at UCLA at the same time, during those same years. And his story reflected and continues to reflect the important role that UCLA students played in the larger Chicano movement. Rosalío spoke about the Viva Zapata fraternity party in May of 1968, which highlighted the anti-Mexican sentiment that existed on this campus. This mobilized UMAS, and it mobilized Rosalío as well. UMAS acted to create and implement an array of initiatives in 1968 and 1969. In fact, the center that you are at right now, this library, is part of one of those initiatives of 1968 that became real in 1969 with the establishment of the Chicano Studies Research Center. It was a student initiative. And there was another initiative that was part of that, and that was the creation of interdisciplinary degree program for Chicano and Chicano Studies. That has become the department that's in Bunch Hall now, right? That grants degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhDs in Chicano and Chicano Studies. Rosalío decided to act. He decided to be a candidate for student body president here at UCLA. I remember his campaign manager, Ramses Noriega. Ramses is a big man. He's a big man. And he came to an UMAS meeting and said, not only you should support a student who's of Mexican descent to be UCLA student body president. He demanded, he pounded on the table and said, you will, you will support Rosalío Muñoz as a candidate for UCLA student body president. I also recall that the fraternities here called UMAS a dangerous and subversive and communist-inspired student organization. And that if Rosalío Muñoz were elected, he would be a puppet. Again, going back to the culture of the institution, 1968-69. I was here when Rosalío was elected student body president. Imagine a Mexican student being elected as UCLA student body president, 1968-69. That was the same year of the walkouts, March 1968, and the same year of the Viva Zapata night party that was given by the fraternity, Fraternity Rome. Our time at UCLA also coincided with the escalation of the Vietnam War and the Chicano movement assuming an anti-war stance. We became aware of how the selective service and the draft were affecting our communities. It was unfair and it victimized communities of color. Ultimately, Rosalío began his journey for social justice that led to the Chicano Moratorium of August 29, 1970. And his lifelong work in the barrios, developing community-based initiatives and coalitions to deal with political change with areas such as housing, health, healthcare, jobs, and other basic issues. When asked about the legacy of the movement, Rosalío commented in the following way, and this is part of his testimonial. The false notion that the Chicano movement is dead. My response is, here I am. I am not dead, not yet. Nor is the movement. It continues in changed form, but it's still, in my opinion, the movement. We might call ourselves Latinos now to be inclusive of other Latin American groups, but the objectives are still very much the same. We are still struggling to control our lives and our destinies. That's what the Chicano movement was all about, and that's what we are still struggling for. Now, let me return briefly to Professor García, who is donating the audio tapes of the oral history interviews with Rosalío. The Research Center is very grateful to receive the collection that will become a part of the Chicano Studies Research Library archive, and that will be accessible to students and other scholars who are interested in studying the Chicano movement. However, Mario has done much more. Mario also donated the tapes that are the foundation for the blowout books, the oral history interviews of Sal Castro. They are here on this campus as well at YRL, and you can access them. So I welcome Professor García, not only for his broad historical research and writing, but also for assuring that UCLA becomes the hub of research in the area of Chicano studies and Chicano studies, because much of the work that he's done also includes gender studies. He's dealt with a number of female figures and has allowed women to better understand the history of Chicanas in the movement. So with those comments, I wish to turn it over to my friends, both Mario, what's your name?
Thank you very much. Buenas tardes. And thank you, Carlos Haro, for your opening comments. It's a real pleasure to be here. Again, at UCLA, we were here about 2 or 3 years ago when we presented on the book, The Chicano Generation, Testimonios of the Movement. But as Carlos Haro, Professor Haro mentioned, This occasion is to mark my donation of the audio tapes that I did in interviewing Rosalío Muñoz. There's 28 audio tapes. It's the old-fashioned cassettes. Some of you don't even know what that means, but the old-fashioned cassettes. There's 28 of them, and they're all, I believe, 90 minutes. And Rosalío did the math a few minutes ago and concluded it was about 42 hours of taping. And the origins of that, as Professor Haro mentioned, was my intent to write an oral history of the Chicano movement in Los Angeles. And this is a project that started many years ago, actually, in the early 1990s. And then it took a rather lengthy period to put it all together. But I finally chose 3 activists that I thought would capture the Chicano movement in Los Angeles. The first was Raul Ruiz, who is, as I referred to him, he's the kind of the Renaissance man of the Chicano movement because he was involved in so many different activities. He was one of the graduate students who supported Sal Castro and the students in the East LA schools in March of 1968 when they walked out in protest to the legacies of segregated and inferior education. And inspired by Sal, Raul and other college students, like here at UCLA, and Raul was an MA student in history at Cal State Los Angeles. And Sal reached out to the students, the college students, because he needed help in organizing the students at their different high schools and middle schools, but also if it had to come to some kind of mass demonstration, as indeed it did, he wanted the college students to be there to help protect the students in case especially if the police came in. And there's a funny anecdote in the book that Sal Sal came here to UCLA and met with the UMAS, maybe it was now at that point called MECHA. Was it UMAS or MECHA in 68?
UMAS.
UMAS. And he had a meeting like this with some of the students, and he told them that the high school kids at East LA were, getting ready to maybe do some kind of mass protest because they had enough of the kind of inferior education, lack of being promoted to go to college. Some of these schools, and this is during the period of the Vietnam War, as Professor Haro mentioned, there were more military recruiters in the East LA high schools than there were college recruiters. What did that tell you? And so there was a tracking system in these schools. You don't often talk as much about the tracking system, but I suspect it's still alive and well in some ways. The tracking system was, and it goes all the way back at least to the 1920s, or even earlier actually, where in the case of what were called the Mexican schools, Mexican-American students were heavily put into more vocational types of education. The boys to learn with their hands, tools, auto body shop work, the girls to learn how to cook and how to sew and so forth. And they de-emphasized the academics. Well, obviously then many kids did go on to colleges, and of course that wasn't promoted at all. So the kids had had enough by 1968. But Sal, in a funny anecdote, came here to UCLA to meet with some of the UMAS students, and he told them that the kids were ready to maybe have some kind of dramatic expression of their discontent. And he said to them, and I'm gonna need your heads. Oh, and the college students, as Sal remembers, oh yeah, because we're at college and we're learning about history, we're learning about philosophy and politics. We can come up with some of the themes and some of the ideology. And he said, no, pendejos. That's not what I mean by your heads. I need your heads in case the cops come down on my kids. You put your heads in front of my kids, and you guys take the blows and so forth. He said, well, he took it well. He understood it. He understood what was going on. But Raul was involved in supporting the walkouts, and he also became a very significant Chicano movement journalist. And for a number of years, he was the editor and publisher, first of what was called La Raza newspaper, and then it became La Raza magazine, which was a glossy publication. In my opinion, the premier Chicano Movement publication of its time in terms of a newspaper or magazine. And so Raul covered much of the movement in LA. But he always never felt that as a journalist, he should not be politically engaged. He never bought into that idea that a journalist had to be somehow distant from the issues that he was covering. He felt that he was always a movement journalist, and that he was an activist, but he was also a journalist. And that's how he approached it. So he was involved in a whole range of things. He was a candidate of La Raza Unida Party in East LA, the attempt by the Chicano movement to establish an independent political party. And he ran twice for the assembly, did not win, but he used those campaigns, and Rosalío was involved in one of those campaigns, to at least promote the issues of the Chicano movement. Raul was also involved with the AntiWar Movement, and he joined with Rosalío in helping to organize the Chicano Anti-War Movement that, as Professor Haro pointed out, was climaxed by the National Chicano Anti-War Moratorium, August 29, 1970. And I'm sure Rosalío will address that. That anywhere between 20, maybe even more, thousand, mostly Chicanos, protested against the war in Vietnam that day, because the war was hurting the Chicano community. Chicanos were being disproportionately drafted into the military, in part because they were, the only way that you got a deferment at that time was that you remained in school. But you had 50% dropout rates in some of the East LA schools, so once they dropped out, Uncle Sam wants you, bang, there they go to basic training, and then many of them on to Vietnam, many of them not coming back. There was a report that was done, the Guzman report, named after Professor Ralph Guzman at Cal State LA, who did a report on the casualties of Chicanos in the Southwest. And he pointed out that the population of the South, Chicanos represented about 10% of the population of the Southwest, and yet they represented 10% of the population, but yet they represented 20% of the casualties. Again, because of disproportionate recruiting or drafting of Chicanos into the military. So Raul was involved in helping to organize the anti-war movement, and he covered that moratorium. And he especially covered, just by happenstance, after the county sheriffs had moved in and basically destroyed the rally at Laguna Park, which is now called Rubén Salazar Park. And there were tear gas, and people were arrested, 3 people were killed. And later in the afternoon, Raul went back down on Wilshire Boulevard toward the east, where the march had commenced, or had marched in that direction. And he found himself across a bar that he later realized was a Silver Dollar Cafe. And he saw a couple of squad cars of deputy sheriffs approaching. They came out, they had their weapons drawn, they had their tear gas projectiles drawn. And he said, something's going on here. And he began to take, with his camera, what becomes these famous shots, pictures. And then he took a picture of showing one of the sheriff deputies approaching the entrance of the Silver Dollar Cafe, the bar. And some people were coming out, and he forces them back in. And within seconds, he shoots at least 2 tear gas projectiles, this size, into the cafe, which was, the door was open, there was just a little piece of cloth at the door. And that tear gas struck one of the hurt people inside the bar. And it just happened to be Rubén Salazar, the premier Chicano, Mexican-American, Latino journalist of his time, who already in the early 60s was writing for the LA Times, covering the Chicano community in part, covering the farm workers' struggle. He was then sent to cover the US invasion of the Dominican Republic. He spent 1 year covering the war in Vietnam, then was brought back to be the bureau chief of the Times in Mexico City. But at the time of the walkouts, which rocked this city people didn't have any sense of how Chicanos, the discontent in the Chicano community, the LA Times found that they had no one to cover this developing Chicano movement. So they brought Ruben back, and he started covering it and reporting on it. And then he also began to write a column, which coincided when he moved over to Channel 34, KMEX, at that time the only Spanish language television station, and he became the news director. And he was doing some really aggressive news reporting, investigative reporting, especially on police abuse. And in fact, the police requested, perhaps even demanded, that KMEX fire Ruben Salazar, which to their credit they did not. So Ruben was there covering the Chicano Moratorium. He and his TV crew had also retired back on Whittier Boulevard and had gone to the Silver Dollar Cafe, and they were there when the sheriff deputy shot right into the cafe, into the bar. One of those projectiles, according to the autopsy, smashed into Ruben Salazar's head, instantly killing him. Those became famous pictures that were published in the LA Times. So Raul was involved in a whole range of issues. The second subject in the Chicano Generation is Gloria, who is less well known, but should be better known. She was out of El Monte, but after she graduated from high school, she soon joined the Brown Berets. She was part of the first female cohort that entered into the Brown Berets here in LA, which was a national chapter, because the Brown Berets spread all over the country. And Gloria's story is remarkable for her leadership. And she and the women, in my estimation, made the most significant contributions to the Brown Berets here in LA. They published their newspaper called La Causa. It was the women who put it all together. But the most significant contribution was that Gloria and the women ran the free clinic on Glacier Boulevard that was part of the Brown Berets outreach into the community. But it was the women who ran it. Gloria was the director, and they ran it for almost 2 years. The men took the glory of having that free clinic, El Barrio Free Clinic, but it was the women who did all the work. But what was also happening that the men, led by so-called Prime Minister David Sanchez, would go to the clinic in the evenings, and they would mess it all up because they would party and all kinds of stuff. And Gloria finally had enough, and she told David, you get your guys together, or we're out of here. And he couldn't do it, which speaks to his leadership or lack of leadership. And Gloria took the women out of the Brown Berets. They linked up with Rosalío in the AntiWar Movement, and then she later established her own free clinic for a period of time, and then started working with the indigenous communities here as part of her own background. And then the third component of the Testimonios of the movement, of course, is Rosalío Muñoz. And that didn't take a lot of, thinking about not including Rosalío, because Rosalío was one of the major leaders of the Chicano movement here in LA, and was the key leader, in my estimation, of organizing the Chicano anti-war movement. No other American ethnic group, including African Americans, organized such a significant anti-war movement in protest against the Vietnam War than the Chicano community, and the Chicano Generation, and the Chicano movement. And Rosalío was very much in the middle of all of that. Rosalío, his family came from Arizona, as I'm sure he'll talk about, and he was raised here in LA and went to high school in Highland Park. He has a distinction of being the first Chicano elected as president of the student body at his high school in Highland Park. And that would be replicated, as Professor Haro mentioned, when he then came to UCLA, joined his older brother here, studied history, and then became involved in activities here, student activities here, and then decided, as mentioned in 1968, in fall of 1968, to run for student body president. And they mobilized the Chicanos here, but they mobilized other third world students, and they mobilized other liberal students here, like the Jewish American students, and they won. And so he also has a distinction of being the first Chicano, Mexican American, Latino elected as I tell my students, to the student, the head of the student government here. And I tell my students, not to Mecha, but to the whole student government. So that was a major breakthrough. But what was lingering over him as well, as there was so many other young Chicanos, was the draft and the Vietnam War. So after he graduated in '68, he was now subject to being drafted because he didn't stay in school. He was working in the Claremont schools, helping to recruit Chicano students there and so forth. And then he got his draft notice. But by then, Rosalío had become more and more politicized. And he became conscious of what the war was doing to Chicanos and other minorities in this country. And he decided that he was not going to allow himself to be drafted, that he would reject his draft notice. But he also decided, now having become much more politicized and more conscious of himself as a Chicano, and seeing himself as part of the Chicano movement, that he wanted to go public on it, not just privately refuse the draft, but to go public on it. And so, what was interesting, when he got his draft notice, he was told that he was to appear at the Selective Service building in downtown LA on the 16th of September, on the 16 of September. And he said, oh my God, this is Mexican Independence Day. He said, well, this is perfect, because then we'll do my public protest publicly on Mexican Independence Day. So he and Ramses Noriega, who had also spearheaded his campaign for student body president at UCLA, began to organize it. They didn't have much time. And so in the morning of September the 16th, with a number of people attending there, some of the media was there, he publicly protested his going into the draft, but he protested it not just for himself, but for so many others, especially Chicanos who were being disproportionately and unfairly being drafted into the military during the course of the Vietnam War. He wanted to do something very similar to what the great heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali, did. A couple of years before, around 1966, Muhammad Ali was also received his draft notice. And he rejected the draft as well. And he also went public on it. And in part what he said was, I am not going to this war in Vietnam. I don't even know any Vietnamese. And no Vietnamese have ever harmed me. But I'll tell you where I'll go to war. I'll tell you where I'll fight. In my home state of Kentucky, where white races have hurt me. If I'm going to do any battle, it will be in my home state of Kentucky against white races, but I'm not going to Vietnam. I don't know any Vietnamese. They've never hurt me. Rosalío wanted to do something similar to that. And in a very famous proclamation, and I want to read it to you, that he penned himself, that came to be known as the I accuse protest statement. What Rosalío said was the following. He said, today, the 16th of September, the day of independence for all Mexican peoples, I declare my independence of the selective service system. I accuse the government of the United States of America of genocide against the Mexican people. Specifically, I accuse the draft, the entire social, political, and economic system of the United States of America of creating a funnel which shoots Mexican youth into Vietnam to be killed and to kill innocent men and women and children. I accuse the education system of the United States of breaking down the family structure of the Mexican people, robbing us of our language and culture, has torn the youth away from our fathers, mothers, grandfathers, and grandmothers. Thus it is that I accuse the educational system of uneducating Chicano youth. Generally, we are ineligible for higher education, and thus are ineligible for the draft deferments, which other college-age youth take for granted, which is genocide. I accuse the American welfare system of taking the self-respect from our Mexican families, forcing our youth to see the Army as a better alternative to living in our community with their own families, which is genocide. I accuse the United States Congress and the selective service system, which they have created of recognizing these weaknesses that they have imposed on the Chicano community and of drafting their laws so that many more Chicanos are sent to Vietnam in proportion to the total population they send of our own of the white youth. I have my induction papers, but I will not respect them. I will not respect the papers until the United States government and people can provide the funds and willingness to improve the educational system so that all Mexican youth, the intelligent, the mediocre, and the tapados, the close-minded, just like the white youth, the intelligent, the mediocre, and the tapados, have the opportunity to go to college and get deferment. I will not respect the papers until the armed forces, the largest domestic consumer of California table grapes, recognizes the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. Until that time, I cannot recognize the armed forces or any of its political uses of the American people. Until they begin to boycott the sellers and growers of California table grapes, I must boycott them. And he concluded, chale con el draft. The hell with the draft. You could say the F word too. With the draft. But, and Rosalío then initially began to organize against the draft, and it became referred to as the Chale con el Draft movement, to educate young Chicanos how they could avoid the draft. But it didn't take long for Rosalío to recognize that the best strategy to deal with the draft was to end the war in Vietnam. So he then began to mobilize very quickly, and already then by December of 1968, the first demonstrations against the war in Vietnam in East LA take place. In February of 1970, you have another even larger demonstration called the March in the Rain, because of the rain that came down that Saturday. And then of course everything mobilized. And Rosalío also went to the Denver Chicano Youth Liberation Conference that spring to get the endorsement of many, many other Chicanos who attended that conference that was headed by Jorge Gonzalez, one of the key leaders of the Chicano movement out of Denver. And so everything was mobilized to have a large national demonstration. There were other demonstrations into that summer, but everything was pointed to August 29, 1970. And Rosalío and others were deeply involved in putting it together, organizing, publicizing it, and very importantly, meeting with the police, specifically the sheriffs, because that was under their jurisdiction, that part of East LA, specifically in Boyle Heights, where much of the march would be on Whittier Boulevard. So everything was prepared. Rosalío thought it was going to be big. How big? Some people had suggested 100,000 and so forth. And then people on August 29th, and the day before, people started coming, and it wasn't 100,000, but it was the largest demonstration during the period of the Chicano movement, 20 to 30,000 perhaps. And they marched, using Whittier Boulevard as the main artery, and came to Laguna Park, where there was already people there, especially older people who came. It was all very peaceful. It was almost like a picnic, Rosalío recalls, already in Laguna Park. There was entertainment already, Mexican music, Mexican dancing. And Rosalío was the first one to speak, to welcome the assembly there, which he did. And his speech is in the book, in the section on Rosalío. But at the end of his speech, Rosalío thought that he saw some movement towards the back of something happening. Now, as he explains to me in our interviews, he said he was a little vain that day, so he didn't wear his glasses. So he couldn't quite see that well, but he thought he saw something happening. Well, there was another speaker that came on, but what was happening was that the deputy sheriffs were beginning to move into the rally to break it up. Now the story is that as the people were coming into Laguna Park, a few Chicanos went to a nearby liquor store and that supposedly they took some stuff without paying, and that the store owner had called the police. There is no record of the store owner calling the police. But even assuming, like I tell my students, even assuming that something like that was happening in that store, one would think one squad car, maybe 2 squad cars, would be sufficient to deal with that issue. But if you see the pictures, as I show my students, of the hundreds of deputy sheriffs that were there already, and then they march in unison with billy clubs and tear gas weapons ready to fire them. They were not there to deal with an incident in a nearby store. They were there to break up that rally. The deputy sheriffs, the police, ruled the streets of East LA. And they were not going to allow for one day Chicanos to rule the streets of East LA. And who knows, we don't know, was FBI involved, was CIA involved, was the Nixon administration, well, we don't know. But there was a police riot that day, and they broke up the demonstration, which was a peaceful demonstration. There were older people there were children there and so forth, tear gas, billy clubs. If you see some again in the photographs, some of the documentaries on what was happening that day, you see the excessive use of force by the sheriff's deputies. 3 people were killed. One was a brown beret, was another guy who was killed almost accidentally driving his car into where all of the melee was happening. Police cars were burned, some storefronts were burned. And then Ruben Salazar, of course, was killed as well. But it was, in some ways, the August 29, 1970, the moratorium, was the apex of the movement, but in some ways it was also somewhat of a tragedy as well. But it did not deter Rosalío and the others. They continued to protest against the war. They continued to work in the Chicano community. Rosalío goes on to become an important community organizer, trying to lay a community base for the Chicano movement on immigration, on housing, and so forth. And so, and of course, that continues as Professor Haro, in reading Rosalío's conclusion, or talking a bit about his own legacy, how he has continued over the years, as he does even today, you know, to work for the community, to work for social justice, to work for democratic rights, and especially in this age of Trump, of trying to deal especially with the situation of the undocumented and what's happening with the Central American refugees that tend to enter. So it's a great privilege for me to write Rosalío's story, as well with Raul Reitz and Gloria. It's a privilege to turn over the tapes of my interviews. We spent 42 hours. I can remember going to Rosalío at one point. Was living in Lincoln Heights, which actually that's where his family lived for a period of time after he was born, or at the time that he was born, or shortly after he was born. So we spent many hours together, and out of that we've also become very, very good friends. I admire him so much, and so I'm going to turn it over now to Rosalío, and he can tell a little bit about his own story. Thank you very much.
Just following up on something Carlos mentioned, that you don't just have to read Mario's books. I think it's really necessary to study them, especially where you have your most interest in your life's work and in your commitment to equality and social justice and peace. Mario began the interviews in about a little past the middle of the 90s, and at that time I was having a difficult time. I was a communist, and I'll get back to that a little later. And in the 20th anniversary of the Chicano Moratorium. I wasn't invited to participate in its organization because I was a communist. And it was said, that's a white organization, not a Chicano organization. Actually, after I met, just before August 29th, I met Mario, and we talked about his book on Ruben Salazar. I still have a different take on Ruben. I think he was assassinated. And I don't think it was because of the police. I think it was because of the war and his opposition to it and what was developing in the Chicano community as on that. But so it was. I was not in a way later or before. I would have had a different kind of input and take on it, and especially later now, because here. On this library, my brother has a collection that's really a 3-generation family collection because, well, he was the attorney for my parents, and he brought the archives of our family here. My grandfather, who was a Methodist minister in Mexico and here, and his whole, and my grandmother, they met in college, in Wesleyan College, Colegio Wesleyano. It's like San Luis Potosi. So I'm really a 3rd-generation college student. And all of my father and his siblings graduated from college, and they weren't rich. Mexican Methodist ministers don't collect a lot of money, but they collect. So, and my mother, though, was a 1st-generation. She was the first one in her family. She was the 3rd from the last of 10 to go to college. And I was speaking out in Arizona at the University of Arizona back in September. So a group of the machistas in some classes, a good-sized group of people. And I told them, you know, when my mother came here in 1933, all the Chicanos met every day. Yes, all 4 of them. They got together for lunch and ate their burritos or tacos, while all the rest were doing sandwiches and what else. And that was really an achievement, I would have to say. My father's family, with 4 of his sisters, helped form. My dad, I think, was the oldest when he was going to graduate school. And they got a master's in the first cohort that they had at Arizona State. And they formed a Chicano group, or a Mexican group, or a Latino group. I forget how they use the terms, but it may have been the first in one school anywhere in the U.S. I talked to some of the Texas scholars, they say could be there, but New Mexico I still haven't really gotten to because they have an early development, a lot more concentrated. So it might be. And actually I wasn't the first student president at Franklin. I found out 4 years ago. My brother looked at our oldest sister, who also came here when I came, not just my brother, my sister was here. Out of about 40 students, Mexican American students, and there were a lot of others from Latin America and stuff. But there was only 40 when I came in 1964, and 2 were my brother and sister. So I had a whole bunch of, all of my aunts were teachers, and 2 of them married teachers, and my father married a teacher, and my mother. So I come from an educated family. So in a way, I was an example. When I came here, I was used to college. And my brother and sister got me used to UCLA. And so in a way, that made the chances of me becoming student body president. I didn't look at it that way. But I was able to get involved in the student movement and other things, and then that transpired. The Chicano movement, actually getting involved in UMAS, then focused my life actually in that work, because I could see at the university, and now cost is a huge factor on eliminating students. But back then they had a thing called the bell curve. And at UCLA, I found out that by the sophomore year or by the junior year, 30 to 50% of the students were no longer at UCLA, and they brought in transfers from the junior college, from other colleges, foreign students, and everything else. So you could be have the brightest class of great people, and they were gonna be getting rid of them in some ways. You know, some was pregnancy, some was this, some was drugs, some was this. But it was policy to get rid of people. How institutions discriminate in general against especially working class students. So I learned that, you know, in some of that involvement. So I kind of represented that for a while, and at the time of the moratorium, I represented, and one of the reasons I chose it, Ramses, my friend, encouraged me to run and then helped me run, was that it make a difference to the East Side. That you could be educated and be part of the movement and not be taken away from the movement. Actually, if you look at the history, so many leaders came up and that became educated or went through the educational system. They sent, like, one of the founders of LULAC, who was in the First World War. They sent him to Spain. Ernesto Galarza was sent to Latin America. Ralph Guzman and others were sent to Mexico and other places. Anywhere but in the Barrio. I think George Sanchez, was sent to the South. So any place but in the Barrio. And then probably similar things happened with African Americans. And that was, so I represented to a large degree someone that was born here and was a Chicano, identified as a Chicano, that said we could go to school, we could become professionals, we could be doing those things and be part of the movement and be part of changing the systemic racism. And I think that's what, in the statement that I had, it was talking about institutional racism, really, which we were beginning to look at as key, as opposed to, let's say, the colonialism concepts that were going out and strong in the Chicano movement. So that was very, very important. Then later on, we had many, many other examples, and the number of people with degrees multiplied. Like my dad was maybe, I think, the 17th PhD Mexican American in 1957. So that was one very important thing also that was a contribution to do. And actually, I didn't intend, when I refused induction, or decided I was going to refuse induction, do it because as a leader, you know, as a Muhammad Ali. My friend Ramses and we talked about it. We need an Ali. And I thought, well, I can't be an Ali, but I can take a stand. And it can set in motion things, because already the major movement people had taken strong stands against the Vietnam War, but they weren't known in the media like Ali or like Martin Luther King as much as Bert Corona, Gorky Gonzalez, Edward Roybal. All kinds of people were taking stands and had on that score. But when I did get that September 16th, when I saw that September 16th, it was, I looked at it, in one way I have a chance to be a hero, and I took it, but you know, it would have its consequences. But the other thing was like Amanda, was like, this is kind of ordained by fate. You know, that it's just there, and do it. You know, but first I had to convince Ramses. Ramses was a hell of an organizer. He'd done things with his, headed up the boycott in Pittsburgh just before I ran for president. And one of the things he did, I just want, you may not imagine it, Carlos probably remembers, to get the farm workers boycott. First of all, my campaign was built on, we started picketing a Safeway that was in Westwood. So we built my campaign at the picket line in Westwood, just down, just a couple blocks from the campus. And then we got fraternities and sororities, all different kinds of groups, and they come to the picket line. And Ron says, are you going to support Rosalío for president? And we built up a successful campaign from that basis. But one of the things after I graduated, and while we were starting the moratorium, to help keep on building the boycott, and by then Mecha had become Mecha, he organized a march from the campus to about 3 blocks down the other side of Wilshire Boulevard. There was the Westward Ho market. And about 5, a lot more had come in, as Sal pointed out, after the walkout. About 500 Chicanos on UCLA marched down Westwood Boulevard, which was like the exclusive spot, the 5th Avenue of LA, and picketed this. And you should have seen Westwood at that time. We were getting on the freeway, all these ladies with silver and purple hair in their Cadillacs. All of a sudden, they weren't going to go to that store anymore unless they felt we weren't going to be there again. But it was just that kind of a dramatic kind of a tactic. Ramses was like that. All Corky Gonzalez, others had so much to do with what we did and the women in the community, as I learned right away, once getting out there, they're the ones that didn't have the macho hang-ups about we have to prove ourselves to anything. They didn't want their kids or the neighbor's kids or anybody's kids to die in that way. And they really were what moved the whole community sentiment on that. And I think I tell the story there. But when I was running around the country with long hair and beads, and I was on a fast, it was Thanksgiving. My mom said my grandmother was over 90, and she said we got to visit her for Thanksgiving, and one of her older brothers starts going after me, and how can you let him do this, walking around all mechudo and all of this kind of stuff. And really, it was really kind of abusive. But my grandmother, he ends up saying, and here all your aunts are cooking their, doing the whole day to fix a good Thanksgiving dinner, and you won't even eat it, because I was on a fast. And my grandmother calls us in to the dining area in the house, and as I'm finding in, she says, Rosalío, vente, siéntate aquí, a mi lado, quiero ver tus ojos, te ves muy mexicano. And that kind of just took the air out of my uncle. He was a very good man and all of that. That took it out. And there was our clan, because she'd been a widow since the Depression. She was the matriarch. And it was clear. The Urias family in Tucson, which arrived there in 1804, was against the war with her nieto, her grandson, kind of thing. And I'm sure that worked out in many, many families all throughout. That's one of the things. Going back into, but I still now, having known much more about the history, like in this library, you get access to my mother's memoirs. I've learned a lot from that. I still look, I don't know if the Chicano community, we grew in population, we grew in involvement because we were on the shoulders of that Mexican-American generation. And now, when our political import is so important, to look back at how the foundations and Ed Roybal and other people established, Tejas in El Paso, or what's his name, Gonzalez in San Antonio, and you could go on in those areas about where we were. And that, we think we need to look more at those roots too that we have for what we did. But the Chicano community, like for me, allowed me to be more Mexican.
What does that say?
It says, I didn't ask to be Mexican. I was lucky to be born or something like that.
I just got lucky.
I just got lucky. Because it did open up our culture and open up our background. And because we had moved further And that was the next step. And of course, the continuing immigration and the continuing discrimination that we saw. So that's, I think, part of that importance of where we were. But also looking at the systemic racism that we have and seeing that that was also affecting the African Americans, and seeing the unjust wars, because it wasn't just what was happening to Chicanos. I do say it was an immoral war. But I said, well, one of the things, what's going to move us is how unfair what they did to us. And when you study, even when I got to know more and looked at the Vietnam War, because it's such a big part of our youth here and my life, and actually its impact on our community, that back in 1966, the Secretary of Defense McNamara, who was a big corporate guy, as he began the manpower prison for the Vietnam War. And he had a program called something like Mission 100,000. Operation, that was a military term, Operation 100,000. And that was to, quote unquote, lower the standards for who could serve in the Army. And there were, some of it was height or weight. We were smaller, but some of it was proficiency in English. And you know how that hit Puerto Rico and the Southwest, for example. And they said that the service has been for both for minorities, some way kind of affirmative action. That's how they got a chance to go to college, to learn skills, to do all of these other things. But studies afterwards showed that those that came in, and it ended up being more like 350,000 brought in on that operation. It was like what I described in my thing. It was like a funnel. They put those recruits or draftees, it was like a direct road to the front lines in Vietnam. So that it was true. It was really official policy. And it was for our good, economically. Meanwhile, they're cutting the poverty program. And the cynicism of all those things. But looking at that, to me, eventually, especially in the mid-70s, where what they now call neoliberalism, and the Communist Party was called, it's a mass offensive of the capitalist system against the people that was worldwide. It became clear to me that just getting Chicanos graduated from college wasn't going to do it. They were going to be hitting us everywhere. And that the immigration policy was really a way of continuing Jim Crow, continuing bracerismo, the bracero program kind of thing, of having a deliberate, cheapest labor that would, and I don't think it's right. It says, well, we don't, lower. When you pay people lower, it helps lower the cost. But if you get involved in struggle and you fight for equality, you fight for justice, you fight for a greater share in what you create as a worker, that overcomes that. So that if you organize the immigrants, that's the solution, not try to keep them away. Because the labor movement from the 19th century says, if the boss hires them, we organize them. And that was what the CIO said in the Depression era, the New Deal era, they called, but the CIO was a major part of the best part of that. That's what they decided to do. We don't separate the blacks, we don't separate the Mexicans, we don't separate the Puerto Ricans, and we work with the community. And that's what Bert Corona and so many of the others came and knew and kept going in our system. So that to me, eventually I began looking at Marxism and Leninism, and to me, it was the same kind of values that I learned as growing up in a very religious family. My mom was Catholic, my dad was Protestant. He was divorced when they married, so she she was excommunicated, but we'd go to Mass 8 o'clock. And we'd be there, Mom wouldn't go up for communion because that was denied her in her religion. And then at 9:30, we'd go to Sunday school in the Methodist church. So that's why I also am very proud to carry this. Who would Jesus deport? Or else they also have who would Jesus bomb when we're at war. Because I see myself, that background that I have, that grew up with, I see myself as a Chicano, Christian, communist, or you could put it in either of those things. I'm a materialist, but the spirituality comes from our social, intellectual participation in reality, in the material world. That's how I look at it. I don't see that they're antagonistic contradictions. So that's another thing in my story I think is unique. You don't find very much about communists or even people for socialism in our histories after the McCarthy era. And you'll see a little bit in the story about how I began looking at the things we're doing, but I started doing those kinds of things as a Chicano. And this just, I think, helped sharpen what I do. And for me, and my contribution, and Gloria or Raul, was to be of service, to move the movement forward, to move the issues forward, to move social justice, equality, and peace forward. And they don't have those ideologies. So that's important. And this book is very key on the Chicano area that helped liberate us more from what the previous generation. And what we did, so that I became a communist. Okay, Gloria is a leader. She's well known in the indigenous communities, organized indigenous communities of this world. If you come, she is the grandmother. She is the spiritual leader of the Tonga people, the first peoples of Los Angeles. So when they come here and identifying as indigenous and want to operate, they want to operate those people, and just important in their belief system, their ancestors, because they're here in the place of the ancestors of these people that take us back in time. And to me, it's very, very significant, and that we look back on that. I go hiking in the hills of Los Angeles. I can see the realm of the Tonga. I can see out to the ocean. I can see out to the mountains, and then the plains that we have here. I think back, well, what were they thinking before the Spaniards came, and how did they use it? And there's a lot to that way of speaking. So knowing Gloria all these years and getting reacquainted in a way during when we started doing historical things and the moratorium and all these things, because I decided, hey, if they want to exclude me for being a communist, they're not going to know Gloria Arenas. They're not going to know Ramses Noriega. They're not going to know so many other, Gilcano or Gonzalo Javier, so many others that have such a rich history in contributing and have lived there all their lives for our people. And so then I began saying, hey, you got to talk to all these people. And a young Yale student, history student, Chicano, said, I'm going to do my history paper on the Chicano Moratorium. And I said, okay, well, don't just talk to me, talk to Gloria, talk to Ramses, talk to Gilbert Cano, talk to all of these different people, and he did. And one of the things I learned from that, the oral histories and all of that, I read, and Gloria says, I saw her as a wonderful administrator and a very person to move people forward. But it said, and Gloria talks about doing organizing in that interview. And she was one of the best organizers. That's all there is to it. And that's what, 25 years later, I realized that, and how far behind we were on being aware. I began to just think if we would have invited her to speak at August 29th. But that wasn't how things worked. It worked out that way, but we should make sure it's much changed now. So those are some of the things that I wanted to bring out. I think I would also, because we're being taped, so I'm adding some things that aren't there. I would add much more about my mother, because she had, when we moved from Lincoln Heights to Highland Park, it was, Highland Park was a Paddy community. It was a white community. And I think Paddy, that's St. Patrick, that's the Irish. But I also looked at what my parents would sometimes use when we're driving back to Arizona in the late night, and they think we're all asleep, and they would talk about patas saladas, which was a term for white people. And I always thought it was because of the pickled pig's feet, which are all white and pink. But I learned out in Arizona, there were some of the senoras over there that said, no, patas saladas referred to being called wetbacks. And they said that's because they came over the ocean, and so their feet are full of salt, and we don't have that salt. We came over a river. And anyway, whatever that term is, but it was a very white neighborhood, and it was not like the barrio of Lincoln Heights. We were very, we were leaders and good athletes, my older brother especially. So we were leaders on our little. And my brother went to a school at Nightingale Junior High, and there were blacks from the projects. There were Chinese from Chinatown. There were Mexicans, Chicanos and Italians from Lincoln Heights. And Mount Washington had professional people, predominantly white in those areas, and they had those things. And my mom was president of the PTA. She also was in the, and I went to meetings that they had at the school, probably like graduation of my older brother and sister. And there's my mom speaking on the podium. And she was a Catholic, but at some of the Methodist church things or community things, she would play the piano. So that was something that would not happen at that time in Highland Park. And we had kids coming over to the house all the time, and we were going to their houses. We were running in, all of that was the way it was in the barrio. Even though it was mixed, there were some whites, mostly kind of obese Archies, but from Missouri was my best friend. But why am I losing my train of thought? But that did not happen in Highland Park until like I was a senior in high school. And you read Ruben Salazar's story. That's the same kind of thing. Or others that were getting educated and bright and achieving in school. That was a very, very common experience, and it's probably still much the same in the hearts of the barrios that we have today. So that was quite a thing that I think helped us all become very successful professionals. I'm the least successful as a professional because as an organizer, but now when I go talk to career days now and then, and they're movement oriented, we need more argument. We need more things. And I have his books out to show the students, the junior high school students. Become an organizer like Sal Castro or Bert Corona or Cesar Chavez or Gloria. And anyway, those are one of the things that my mother's role. My dad was off in graduate school besides working. And then after he got his PhD, then he's teaching to train people to work, because he was good at working with Mexicans, with blacks, with whites, Jews. And he helped integrate that part of social work in the school system here in LA. So just to sum up a little bit, I think how education can benefit the community. And we got to be involved. And right now, one of the big problems we have, and I see I'll finish with this one to consider, that we all have to, I think, look at confronting, we're faced with this gentrification. We thought it was called urban renewal. I think I made a big contribution. You can read a little bit about it in the book. But I think it's, you know, we had that huge economic bubble that burst, and then how many millions of homes of the lower income working people, especially black and Chicano, were repossessed and then picked up and flipped to make more money. And even some of our own people were involved in that, of course. And now that's changed. That began the whole changing of who owned homes and what was their economic level and all of those things. And now, to me, it's part of the capitalist economic system, kind of this, you know, bump out the poor, like musical chairs. And it's part of the way they're dealing with many places in the inner cities, in particular, throughout the country, that to take away the pro-labor, the pro-civil rights, pro-human rights, the kinds of things that we have made those gains. And in Los Angeles and California, our Chicano movement helped with our alliances with blacks, with whites, with gay, lesbian, etc., with the Jewish community, with the labor movement. That has been a big foundation. And that was one of the things that many of us developed, and especially went the labor route in the community. If we can come together with the labor movement, especially with these other allies, we can make LA a labor town, a union town, which we have relative to the rest of the country. And we can make California into, well, they called it a blue state, but we can make it into a people's movement state. And we've done that. And we have to see, though, that came from organizing from the bottom, which were the people of the Mexican-American generation have to do.
Well, maybe some of you might have some comments or questions for us about Rosalío Muñoz's story, about the moratorium, about the Chicano generation that I write about in this book and so forth. One thing that I would just add briefly, I mean, for us in our community, in our field of Chicano history, oral history is very important because it helps fill in a lot of gaps that you don't find in the archives. We're beginning to fill those archives a lot more, and people like you donating your papers and all of that, but there's still a lot of gaps, and oral history is very important. Carlos Haro mentioned my recently published book on Father Luis Olivares, who's best known as the key leader of the sanctuary movement in LA in the 1980s. And that's a biography, not a testimonio, but Father Olivares died in 1993, and I never met him actually, and never obviously then interviewed him. But, and I did build a book on archival materials that I found in different locations, but I couldn't have done the book without oral history. I did 93 interviews for that book alone, and that filled in a huge number of gaps. But so oral history has been very, very important. I get my students in my classes, they all have to do oral history projects. In my 20th century Chicano history course, which we're wrapping up right now, they had to do their term papers as oral history projects, interviewing people age 40 and above, because I wanted them to interview people already with some level of maturity, but also and of age, but also it gave many of my Chicano Latino students the first opportunity to interview either their parents or their grandparents. And so it's important for us to get these stories down, and that's why oral history is so indispensable, just to fill in a lot of gaps. So again, maybe some of you have some questions or comments. Yes, sir.
If you both I like to talk about the election in the primaries, of how the Latino community, the Clintons came in and divided the Latino community. The young people were for Bernie Sanders, and the older generation for the Clintons. And look what history, they went and divided the Latino community. Where if you look at the Kevin De Leon, 3 generations voted for him. It wasn't enough, but it's a calling signal that, you know, your time has come. But why did you listen? Why didn't your generation listen to the kids about why they wanted Bernie? You guys stuck with Clintons in the primaries.
You mean you know how I voted? Or what?
No, but that's why Clinton won California. It could have turned around. There still is a big divide because of that.
We don't know. I mean, I've seen competing.
Did you see when she kind of come to East LA and the East LA kids, we don't want you?
Well, I've seen competing figures about the Latino vote 2 years ago.
Yeah.
One suggests that in fact,
in the primary.
well, beyond the primary, in the general election.
But in the primary mattered because if you would have voted, if all 3 generations would have stuck together, we would have got Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, maybe, but I mean, to that I would say, that assumes that the Chicano Latino vote is monolithic, which it is not.
It's not, but I'm talking about.
You know, 30% of Latinos in
Yeah.
the general election voted for Trump, but having said that, I mean, I've seen the figures in the general election that the Latino vote was actually up from 2012, but then I've also seen competing figures, not so much competing figures, but that of the eligible Latino voters in 2016, less than 50% voted in the general election. So that's significant. That means over 50% of eligible voters, Latino voters, did not vote. And so that's one of the challenges I think coming up with in 2 years. Although I'm curious to see the figures for the recent midterm elections, because my sense is that the Latino vote was very, very heavy in many, many areas, certainly here in California. So, but you know, I mean, going back to the primaries, I mean, yeah, my students largely, that anecdotally, seem to be for Bernie Sanders. I think you may be right that maybe older Latinos were more for Clinton, but that's okay, that's fine. I mean, it's important to have that kind of a diversity as long as people go out and vote, and in the end realize that by not voting, you're allowing someone like Trump to get elected. You want to comment on
Well, Mario and I had a debate about that before the 2016 election, and I have a different view on it. I never made much money, and Social Security is very important. And where Bernie was at in advocating along issues like that, or like Medicare and Medi-Cal, with what we do, have much better and has a lot more to it. And so that's a perspective I had. I want somebody that's going to fight for that, not just on how I ideologically or how I assess the layout of different forces in this country and in the world on it. But you always had, you know what, the biggest vote was all across the board was the women's vote. And I think it was the most outstanding. The Latino vote, I think we'll find out also, was very, very important. And the push from the grassroots was very important. The last minute vote by mail, just coming in the last hours, and there was a whole more movement sense that we had at this time. So I think that's more important than looking at Clinton and Bernie. You know, I hope Bernie runs. If she runs, hey, that's her right. You know, I says I don't think I'm not going to want to get involved, but I would want to be. We have to be building the base, and we have to be building the base in Kentucky and Mississippi, because there's still tens of millions of voters that are with Trump. okay, but who have been put there, they've been developing that kind of thing. One of the biggest ones was the Bush that just died.
But the
You know,
Clintons took over the Democratic Party, owned the Democratic Party, and squashed
they don't own it.
They
They're
did.
not- they're not
They
rich enough
controlled
to
all the.
own it.
Didn't you see the papers that came out? The WikiLeaks papers of what they were doing, the Bernie Sanders people.
This
You
is
know?
obviously a discussion that will all
I know.
continue.
Let's talk
But
about
there was
De
a-
Leon.
back there,
You didn't talk about
if
De
you don't mind,
Leon. What do you
someone
thought
else
about
had
that?
a comment or question back there. Yes.
Thank you, three gentlemen, for this time and what you guys have shared. I appreciate it. It brought up perhaps, and this is off your subject, but you may have a direction I could go to that'll help me a great deal in what I'm involved with. I work in the entertainment industry, filmmaker and television productions, independent level, and also big projects as Avatar 2, 3, 4, and 5, Transformers, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so the big tentacles. So I'm in those groups and in those meetings of where the money gets funded for particular movies. And coming from my parents from Mexico, but being born here, the Chicano background I have, I've had strong faith, and I've always agreed with one of my Cholo cousins, because he always said the Latinos are going to start spending more and more money. And I think he's had a point. He's a very educated guy, and it's taken 20 years for me to see these things come to fruition. I'm hoping you may have, maybe you know the data. I'm looking for the data that I can comfortably go back to these large discussions on what movies or what fundings they're going to start to support more. I'm always saying there's a lot of money in the Latino economic spendable funds of Mexicans, Americans, in not just the United States, but in California, on what movies they would like to see, but they don't exist. And for me, I'm in those meetings, and I'm in the union of filmmakers, so I can get the conversation and the platform going. I don't have enough data for me to, and this is a very new project for me, but for me to say, here's a lot of money here. Coco is just one example of how successful where I'm going this could be. I believe there's a lot more untapped money spendable that could be a hybrid production movie made by Americans or made by Hollywood, but targeted to the Spanish American speakers. Where would I go for this kind of solid information to say, here are the movies that have made the money? I know I could Google this, but you guys might have some good data on the Latino financial power. Does my question make sense?
Yeah, but I personally don't have any real
That's
answer to that, but I guess, you can get figures from the movie industry itself. I think I remember reading
Which
actually,
will exist, but I'm looking,
Yeah.
I'm hoping one of you guys have a contact and say, this is a guy who knows these kind of numbers.
yeah.
Sorry,
That's
but
okay.
but
Alex Nogales might know this. Alex Nogales does a representation of minorities in films and TV and everything. And his office is in Pasadena.
Alex what?
Alex Nogales. He used to be a producer at CBS.
Alex, how do you spell his last name, please?
Nogales.
Nogales.
N-O-G-A-L-E-S. And also Lionsgate Films is the greatest promoter of Latino films in the industry right now. And they've done all the best films that have done really well in the crossover.
Like his right star.
to get back into trying to relate that to what we've been talking about, and I think one of the great things, one of the reasons I think it's important to study things he has written, and many others, of course, but particularly Mario's work, he places it in U.S. history terms. Where is this in our trek? Where is this in our participation in our lives in this? And it's going to be greater. And I think when you look at the finals on the vote, it will be there, and it's going to be with women more than with men. And that, so I would see that that's where the votes kind of are in participation, and then what is going to, it's the same policy we have with politics. What is going to bring more of the participation of the youth. And some of that will be, how are they gonna keep up with what their parents made? Because that's not been happening for most of since the 70s, really, in terms of the people of the United States and of our communities as well. So I would say that those are very, very key things. Now, of course, there's the whole, I think there's a hemispherical thing that we have as part of globalization. And you know, I have some differences, but like looking at what we are as a hemispherical indigenous people. And we're learning more and more about those things as the indigenous become more important. And as we have to look to that relationship with nature and with each other, to be looking for where fundamentally changing things so that we're around it. And there's our descendants in the 22nd century. So that I think those are places to look. And Mario has been he's bringing in now the 21st century Latinos generation and bringing that out amongst the students that he's worked with. And one of the very key thing too, looking at the faith communities and the faith movements as a part of moving people is certainly something that we need here. And I was just a few things, you know, that I participated in an event about Mahatma Roshan, who grew up in Tijuana as a Baptist and became a big leader in the walkouts and it's continued in terms especially of Latino education with parents and projects. Very instructive. And then of course there's the Olivares book that Mario has come out with that gives so much background and brings out the importance of his contribution, but that contribution that we need now. We just had Armistice Day was the 100th anniversary of the Muñoz family moving from Torreon, going to and entering in at El Paso. And actually their processing of coming into the U.S. was stalled because they found out Europe had declared peace. And people went into the streets and celebrated. And my Aunt Rebecca, who was about 2 at the time, maybe a little over 2, she said, I thought they were welcoming me. But anyway, that was, so the Methodist Church in the Placita had a ceremony celebrating their ministry of my grandparents, and our most of all of the grandchildren are relating to a congregation or a parish and participatory, and myself even as a materialist, dialectical materialist, am doing that.
I think there was did you have a question back there, a comment, or did you want to make a question?
Actually, I'm fascinated. Continue, Rosalío. I'll do it when you. I don't want to interrupt your thought, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about las Adelitas participated in the moratorium.
Oh, yeah. Well, Gloria, in the section on Gloria, read that because by the second moratorium, just the week before, Gloria called for there being a Las Adelitas coming together. I don't know if they used the term there, but she called, she says, are you involved in the movement? Are you dissatisfied with some kind of things? Do you think you can fulfill yourself with that? There's a beautiful leaflet that was put out the week before the March of the Rain, so that would have been for the 21st or 22nd of February that they met. And also, they had talked with other people. It wasn't just a beret thing, because in that march, there's a film, that beautiful film that was done, that I really love, But they introduced Alicia Escalante, who is introduced by the wife of Oscar Acosta, Zeta Acosta, Socorro, that I went to high school with, as the Adelita of all the Adelitas. So there was a broader discussion of having women participating as women in what they did. That emerged there. There had been discussions at some of the university level about feminism, but women, not using the term feminism, this was part of a trend that was emerging during the war, and it was part of the peace movement. That, you know, guys were, you know, dominating there, and women began forming and doing things. And that was happening in its own way, and within the development of our struggles there. And so they did. I didn't even know that it really happened. I was so focused on what we were doing, and I didn't notice it, didn't give it the like I said, 20-some years later, I still said, well, Gloria was an organizer, you know, and so was Alicia, as one of the students there at Santa Barbara is doing her dissertation work and has done much to with Alicia, show that that growing importance of women's role in the Chicano movement at that time. So that was very much a part of what was, and Gloria was actually when I came to that realization and started bringing it into things, and she talks a little bit about it at the beginning of the story, that you need recognition. We weren't getting recognized for what was happening, and that was part of the gripe of what was going on with the women in the berets and in those kinds of things. And actually, maybe the guys, she wasn't a founder, but I think she was going to, what was the name of the coffee house? La Piranha Coffee House. Well, that was functioning. And so the berets came out of that. So they were part of and when the berets did come out, she said, well, I wanted something militant. You know, my experience, that militants in El Monte, which they went through, but I can't go through all of it. But she got involved that there were big, and in the early 60s, like West Side Story, there were big in LA and all around confrontation between the whites and the Chicanos in Pico Rivera era. Roman Salazar wrote up a big thing in '62 about what happened there. Dionisio Morales, one of the big, got involved there criticizing the police, and Pete Pitches didn't like what Ruben was writing about. But in El Monte, she says, you know, there would be fights, and the police would come riding their motorcycles in the halls, and then they'd arrest the Chicanos. And then, but she was part of a group that one of the inspiring white teachers got involved to try to get some sense. And actually, she went to the second with a couple others from that group, Camp Hess Kramer, as part of her role in trying to get a fair situation at her high school.
One question of Rosalío. In your testimonial, you note that you changed your name.
Yeah, well, I didn't change my name. I reclaimed my name. No, well, you may not remember, but when we had the, they had the Greek power rally and all of that stuff, protesting, they're getting the Phi-Psis getting, what was it, temporarily for a year or two, I forget, instead of throwing them off the campus recognition, suspension, being suspended, and then the student council voted with the fraternities. And this woman that sat next to me started, some of my best friends are in UMOS, but I sat down right there, wrote my resignation. There were only a couple of weeks left in the term, but I was it was too much. I didn't want to be operating on that level there. And they had to recognize that. And actually, I was raised, if you look at when I went to junior high school, they had me as Rosalío. Or when I graduated from junior high and from high school, Rosalío was on there. When my mom and dad were most affectionate in our presence, he was Rosalío, not Ross. When they told my dad during the Depression, he got a scholarship to the University of Chicago. And he was advised at that time, if you go back east, don't send a photograph. Change your last name and show up. Maybe they'll take you. That was what the situation was. And one of the things, my family, my cousins, my brothers and sisters will call me Ross and Rosalío. My mom would, because my dad was Rosalío. But anyway, and they like me as Ross, they still do. But they also like me as Rosalío. And so that was a political decision I made, that let's make it easier for other people to do that way, and that's the way I prefer to do that. I just close friend of Maria Elena Dunazo, who made friends with her in the Bay Area after she and Carlos Vasquez left here, Evelina Marquez. Worked very strong and very close with Maria Elena. And so when she started calling me Ross at the campaign office, let's make it Rosalío, okay? And then I went through how because we hadn't dealt with each other, in decades. And she calls me Rosalío, but she might call me Ross just to get a little bit that way. But, one of the things that makes me feel real good about it is looking at my dad's last years when he was running a department of the school district. On his nameplate on his desk was Rosalío in the 70s when he had that position.
Yeah, well, I think we're at a point. I want to thank the Chicano Studies Research Center. We both do.
Oh, yeah.
I want to thank Rebecca Epstein, Carlos Haro for hosting us, and for you for being here. And there is a reception over here at the conference room down the hall there, so you're all welcome to attend. Thank you all very much. Yeah, there's copies of the book over there.
Oh, this one, I have to